There is a grief that the world has no adequate name for. It sits in a category above ordinary loss and below confirmed death, the grief of not knowing. The grief of a body that was never found, a story that was never finished, a face that exists in your memory at a fixed age while time keeps moving, and the person attached to that face may or may not be moving with it. It is the grief of a question mark where a period should be, and it is arguably the most difficult form of loss a human being can be asked to carry. Because you cannot mourn fully, because hope keeps interrupting. Walter Grimes had carried that grief for 17 years. He was 58 years old, a high school history teacher from Louisville, Kentucky, a man who had spent his entire professional life teaching young people about the documented past while living, privately, inside a present that refused to resolve. He was, by all accounts, a patient and thoughtful man. He was not prone to dramatic statements or easy emotion. He had learned over 17 years to carry what he carried quietly, because the alternative was to let it carry him. His daughter's name was Simone. She had been 21 years old the last time anyone who loved her had seen her alive. And for 17 years, Walter Grimes had not known whether that last time was also the final time. Steve Harvey had been in the entertainment industry for over 3 decades. He had seen things on this stage that moved him, surprised him, and occasionally changed him in ways he felt over the long term rather than the immediate. But when his producers came to him before the taping on a Monday morning in January 2024 and told him what they had put in motion, he was quiet for a very long time before he said anything at all. Then he said, "Make sure we do this right. Make absolutely sure." What happened that Monday afternoon in a television studio in Los Angeles will be discussed by the people who were in the room for the rest of their lives. And it begins, as so many of the most important stories do, not with a miracle, but with an ordinary man who simply refused, for 17 years, to stop believing that one was possible. Walter Grimes grew up in Louisville, the only child of a postal worker and a church organist who had between them a combined work ethic so formidable that Walter often joked, in the self-deprecating way of someone who is not entirely joking, that he had never quite managed to live up to it. His father delivered mail in every weather condition for 34 years without missing a single scheduled route. His mother played the organ at morning and evening services for a congregation that grew, over the decades she served it, from 40 members to 400. They were people who showed up. It was the most fundamental value of the household Walter grew up in, and it was the value he carried into every room he had ever entered as an adult. He had married at 26, a woman named Carolyn who taught elementary school and had a laugh that Walter described, when asked, as the reason he had proposed. They had 2 children, Marcus, born in 1989, and Simone, born in 1993. Walter coached Marcus's baseball teams and drove Simone to her Saturday art classes, and attended every school performance and parent-teacher conference and sports day with the consistent, unceremonious presence of a man who understood that showing up was not a gesture but a practice. Simone was, from early childhood, her father's most recognizable reflection. She had his patience, his curiosity, and his tendency to arrive early and stay late wherever she went. She was also, unlike her father, an artist, gifted in a way that the Louisville school system noticed and encouraged, and that Walter quietly marveled at without fully understanding, the way a person marvels at a talent that did not come from them. She painted. She drew. She covered every available surface of her bedroom with work that the art teachers at her high school described, in letters of recommendation written for her college applications, as possessing an emotional intelligence unusual in someone her age. She went to the University of Tennessee on a partial arts scholarship. She called home every Sunday. She sent her father photographs of her work with handwritten notes on the back explaining what she had been thinking when she made them. Walter kept every note. He kept them in a shoebox in his closet, organized by date, which was the most organized he was about anything in his personal life, and which Carolyn found both endearing and revealing about how seriously he took the correspondence. In her junior year, Simone's roommate introduced her to a man named Derek. Derek was charming in the way that presents as confidence, and is sometimes exactly that, and sometimes something else entirely. By the time Simone's family understood which kind it was, she had graduated, moved with Derek to Atlanta, and gradually, so gradually that each individual step seemed small, reduced her contact with her family to a frequency that became, over 18 months, cause for serious concern. The last conversation Walter had with his daughter was a phone call in March 2007. She had sounded strained. She had said she was fine. She had said she would call again soon. She had not called again. When Walter called back 2 days later, the number was disconnected. When he drove to Atlanta 3 weeks after that, the address he had for her was an apartment that the building manager said had been vacated 6 weeks prior. No forwarding address left. The missing persons report was filed in April 2007. The investigation that followed, thorough, genuinely thorough, Walter would later acknowledge, produced evidence that Simone had left Atlanta voluntarily, that there was no evidence of foul play, that she was, at the time of her disappearance, a 21-year-old adult with the legal right to go wherever she chose without informing anyone. The detective assigned to the case told Walter, with the careful compassion of someone who had delivered this category of information before, that the most common outcome in cases like Simone's was that the individual eventually re-established contact when they were ready. Walter thanked him. He drove back to Louisville. He sat in Simone's childhood bedroom for a very long time. The years that followed were the years Walter later described as the years of the two lives. There was the outer life, school, colleagues, Marcus's wedding, the grandchildren who arrived in time and whom Walter loved with the open, uncomplicated love that grandparents are permitted in a way that parents sometimes are not. And there was the inner life, which ran parallel to the outer one, and which consisted primarily of a sustained and disciplined refusal to accept that Simone was gone permanently. He hired 2 more private investigators over the years. He maintained a Facebook page addressed directly to her public posts, updated monthly, telling her about the family, telling her she was loved, telling her there would be no questions and no judgment if she came home. He sent a birthday message into the void every May 14th for 17 years. Carolyn, who had processed her grief differently and arrived over time at a place of quieter acceptance, supported Walter in all of this without fully sharing it. She loved him for the refusal. She also worried, as people who love stubborn people always worry, about what the refusal was costing him. What neither Walter nor Carolyn knew, what no one in the Grimes family knew, was that Simone had been reading those Facebook posts for 6 years. The Family Feud application had been submitted by Marcus, Walter's son, who was 35 and had inherited enough of his father's stubbornness to have spent the previous 2 years quietly working a parallel track to Walter's, not hiring investigators, but doing the patient, methodical work of digital research that a younger generation does differently than the one before it. Marcus had found Simone 8 months before the taping. He had found her through an artist's profile on a regional craft marketplace, a woman selling paintings under a different last name, a woman whose work, when Marcus looked at it carefully, had a quality he recognized without being able to immediately name. He had stared at those paintings for a long time before he understood what he was recognizing. He was recognizing the handwriting on the backs of the photographs, the same emotional intelligence, the same eye. He had reached out through the marketplace's messaging system. The message he sent was 3 sentences. "My name is Marcus Grimes. I think you might be my sister. Our father has been looking for you for 17 years. Simone had not responded for 4 months. When she did, the message was brief. She was well, she was safe. She was not ready to explain everything, but she was not in danger. She asked for time. Marcus gave it to her, which was the hardest thing he had done in his adult life, and he told no one, not his mother, not his father, because he understood that raising Walter's hope, and then having it collapse again was a cruelty he was not prepared to be responsible for. Over the following months, Simone and Marcus exchanged messages with increasing frequency. The story that emerged was the story of someone who had spent years inside a relationship that had systematically dismantled her sense of self, her connection to her family and her trust in her own judgment, and who had eventually escaped that relationship and spent the years since rebuilding, slowly and with considerable courage, a life that was genuinely her own. She was 38 now. She lived in Chattanooga, Tennessee, 70 miles from where she had gone to university. She worked as a graphic designer and sold her paintings on weekends at local markets. She had a small apartment with a garden. She had friends who knew her full name and her full story. She had a therapist she had been seeing for 4 years who had, over that time, helped her arrive at the place she now occupied. A place of sufficient steadiness to consider, seriously and without panic, the possibility of returning. The Facebook page had been part of what brought her to that place. She had found it 6 years earlier on a night when she had searched her father's name on an impulse she had not fully understood. Reading his posts, the monthly updates, the birthday messages, the simple and unstinting declarations of love directed into an unknown space had affected her in ways she had spent 6 years processing. She had wept the first time. She had wept again the 20th time. She had shown the page to her therapist, who had asked her what she felt when she read it. Simone had said, Like he's been standing at a door with the light on for 17 years. When Marcus explained what he had in mind, the family feud taping, the controlled environment, the presence of a counselor on standby, the fact that Walter would be surrounded by family when it happened, Simone had sat with it for 3 weeks before she agreed. What had decided her in the end was not the logistics or the safety of the setting, though those mattered. What decided her was a single question she asked herself that she had been practicing under her therapist's guidance, asking in moments of significant decision. What would it cost me to wait longer? She had been waiting in various forms for 6 years. The answer to the question was clear. The Grimes family team, Walter, his wife Carolyn, Marcus's wife Denise, and Walter's younger brother Harold, arrived at the studio in the particular state of a family that is containing several different emotional registers at once. Walter was relaxed and enthusiastic in the way he always was when given a structured task to focus on. Carolyn was quietly observant. Marcus was managing a tension in his chest that had not left him since he booked the flights. Harold, who had been told only that this was going to be a special taping and nothing more, was simply glad to be there. Denise, who was in on the secret, kept looking at her father-in-law across the green room with an expression that Marcus had to gently ask her to moderate. In the pre-show interview, Walter talked about teaching, about the particular satisfaction of watching a student understand something for the first time, the moment when the material stopped being abstract and became personally relevant to them. He talked about history as a subject that was only ostensibly about the past. Everything in history is really about the present, he said. The past is just context. What we're always really asking is, how do we get from where we were to where we need to be? The interviewer, aware of what the afternoon held, found it difficult to maintain a neutral expression. The main game was close and well played. Walter turned out to be, as many teachers are, exceptionally good at thinking in terms of common responses. He spent his professional life calibrating his explanations to what the average student in a room was likely to understand, which was not so different from calibrating answers to what 100 surveyed Americans were likely to say. The Grimes team pulled ahead in the final rounds through a combination of Walter's instincts and Harold's 2 consecutive #1 answers, which Harold celebrated with an enthusiasm that briefly and genuinely threatened to bring the game to a halt. When the main game was won and the partition was drawn for fast money, Marcus walked to the podium first. He scored 147 points, a strong score, built with the controlled precision of a man who was operating on considerably less sleep than he normally required and was determined not to let it show. That left Walter needing 53 points, achievable, reasonable, and in the architecture of what was about to happen, almost entirely beside the point. Walter stepped up to the podium. The studio lights were very bright. The audience had the quality it gets when it knows something is coming, but does not yet know its exact shape. A held breath attentiveness, a collective leaning in. Steve Harvey walked to Walter's side. He looked at him for a moment in the way he had looked at Raymond Carter, at Dorothy Simmons, at the others, with the full attention of a man who is seeing not just the person in front of him, but the weight the person is carrying and what it has taken over a long time to keep carrying it upright. Walter, Steve said, I hear you're a history teacher. 31 years, Walter said. 31 years, Steve repeated. So you know something about the long game. Walter smiled. You have to. History doesn't move fast. No, Steve said quietly. It doesn't. He paused just long enough for the sentence to hold more than its surface meaning. Then 20 seconds. Here we go. Name something a father never gives up on. Walter answered without a pause. His child. Name something worth waiting 17 years for. A silence of 2 full seconds, the longest pause in the round, and then in a voice that was steady only because Walter Grimes had had 31 years of practice keeping his voice steady in front of people. The truth. Name something that makes a grown man cry when he's alone. Hope. Name what a father's faith looks like. Showing up every day. Name the thing that makes a family whole. Walter looked straight ahead. He said, the ones you thought were gone. Buzzer sounded. The audience did not applaud. It was not a failure of enthusiasm. It was the response of 200 people who were no longer in a game show and understood it. Steve Harvey was very still. He turned to the board. His child, #1 answer, 48 points. The truth, #1 answer, 35 points. Hope, #1 answer, 31 points. Showing up every day, #1 answer, 29 points. And the last answer. Steve Harvey looked at the board. He looked at Walter. He looked at his production team at the edge of the stage. He turned back to Walter. The ones you thought were gone, he said. Survey said, The board turned. Number one answer, 42 points. Total, 332 points. The studio should have erupted, but Steve Harvey raised one hand, a single, quiet gesture, and the room held. "Walter," he said. And his voice in 17 years of watching this clip has never been described as anything other than the gentlest thing he has ever said on this stage. "I need to tell you something." Walter looked at him. "Simone is alive." The room did not make a sound. "She is here, she is well. She has been working her way back to you for a long time, and she is ready." Walter Grimes did not move. This is what everyone who was in the room that day remembers most clearly. Not the reunion itself, but the 5 seconds before it, when Walter stood at the podium and received the information that his daughter was alive and present, and processed it in the only way a person can process something of that magnitude. Incompletely, slowly, in layers, his face moving through expressions that had no stable names because no face had been built to carry this particular news in this particular way after this particular length of time. His wife Carolyn, watching from behind the partition, had known since the previous evening. Marcus had told her the night before, because he had decided that the revelation should not be entirely without warning for both parents. She had wept for 4 hours. By the time she arrived at the studio, she had arrived at a stillness that was not calm, but was the thing on the other side of the most thorough weeping of her life. When she heard Steve Harvey say the words, she pressed both hands flat against her sternum as though she needed to hold something in place. Marcus was looking at his father. Denise was looking at Marcus. Harold, who had not been told anything, stood with his mouth open and his eyes filling in the specific way of someone who is catching up to a reality that everyone else in the room has already inhabited. At the back of the stage, a door opened. Simone Grimes was 38 years old. She was wearing a dark green dress that she had bought for this day and which her therapist had told her when she showed it to her over video call the night before was exactly right. Her hair was natural and worn clothes. She was carrying nothing, no bag, no props, nothing to hold on to. She had decided that deliberately. She had decided that she was going to walk into this room with her hands empty and open. She stood in the doorway for a moment. Across the stage, her father stood at the podium. And in the space between them, 40 feet of studio floor that represented, in its way, 17 years of distance and the whole complicated human architecture of loss and love, and the imperfect, necessary courage it takes to come back, they looked at each other. Walter said her name. He said it the way a person says something they have said 10,000 times in private, and are saying aloud in public for the first time, with the care of long habit and the rawness of sudden exposure. Simone. She crossed the stage at a pace that was not slow and not rushed, the pace of a woman who has made a decision and is honoring it without spectacle. When she reached her father, she put her arms around him, and he put his arms around her, and neither of them spoke, and neither of them needed to, and the audience, all 200 people who had come to watch a game show on a Monday afternoon in January, were entirely, collectively undone. Steve Harvey stepped back. He stepped back far enough to be out of frame, which was not an accident and was not a small thing for a man who had spent his entire career understanding where the camera was. He stepped back because he understood, in a way that the best television hosts understand and the merely good ones do not, that the most powerful thing he could do at this moment was disappear. He did not disappear entirely. He was there. He was watching. And the expression on his face, visible to the crew members who were watching the monitors, visible in the broadcast cut that aired weeks later, was the expression of a man who has just been reminded of something he already knew but needed to know again. That the reason he had this platform, the reason any of this existed, was for moments exactly like this one. Not the games, not the scores. This. The reunion expanded as reunions do. Carolyn coming through from the partition with both hands still pressed to her chest, then wrapping Simone in her arms with a sound that was not a word and did not need to be. Marcus holding his sister, and then holding his father, and then holding them both at the same time in the impractical, completely earnest way of a man who spent 8 months carrying a secret that was almost too large and is now, finally, free of it. Harold weeping openly and without apparent embarrassment in the background, which was the most Harold thing Harold had ever done. When the reunion had settled enough for conversation, when the family had found their way to a shared stillness on the stage, Steve Harvey sat down with Walter and Simone. He did not ask Simone to explain herself. He did not ask Walter how he felt. He asked one question to each of them, and he asked it simply. To Simone, what do you want your father to know? She thought about it for a moment. She had prepared for many possible versions of this conversation, but she answered without her notes. I want him to know that I read every post, she said. Every single one for 6 years, and every time I read them I knew that when I was ready, really ready, not just trying to be ready, he would still be there. The posts told me that. They told me the door was open. They told me I wasn't running out of time. She paused. I want him to know that his faith in me kept something alive in me that I needed to stay alive. And I want him to know that I'm sorry it took so long, but I had to be whole before I could come back. I couldn't come back broken. He deserved the whole version. Walter nodded. He was not looking at the camera. He was looking at his daughter. Steve turned to Walter. And what do you want her to know? Walter was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when he was organizing something that mattered into the right words. Then he said, I want her to know that the door was never locked, not for one day, not for 1 hour. He looked at Simone directly. And I want her to know that hole is how I always saw her, even when she couldn't see it herself. Simone pressed her lips together. She nodded once slowly with the expression of someone receiving something that has been owed for a very long time. Steve Harvey looked at the two of them for a moment. Then he turned to the camera and said the thing that would be quoted from this episode more than anything else he said that day. Faith, he said, is not the belief that everything will be okay. It is the decision to keep the light on anyway. Walter Grimes kept the light on for 17 years, and tonight his daughter found her way home by it. The episode aired 5 weeks after the taping. The response was unlike anything the Family Feud production team had encountered in the show's history. The clip of Steve Harvey saying, Simone is alive, 3 words, delivered in the quietest register of his professional voice, was viewed over 60 million times in the first 48 hours. It was shared not primarily through entertainment channels but through personal messages, parent to child to parent, sibling to sibling, attached to words that were variations on the same essential sentence. I love you and I want you to know the door is open. Crisis support organizations that work with families affected by estrangement and disappearance reported significant increases in contact from both sides of those situations. From parents who had been waiting and wanted guidance on how to maintain hope without letting it become harm, and from adult children who were somewhere in the process of finding their way back and wanted to understand what that process might look like. Several organizations cited the clip directly in their outreach materials, using Walter's Facebook page as a case study in how to hold open a space for someone who is not yet ready to step through it. Simone's reintegration into the family was managed with the care and honesty that her years of therapy had equipped her to bring to it. She did not move back to Louisville. She remained in Chattanooga, where she had built her life, and the family came to her as much as she came to them. A deliberate arrangement that reflected the family's collective understanding that Simone's recovery had required her to construct an independent life of her own, and that this independence was not a barrier to family connection but a precondition of it. Walter drove to Chattanooga once a month. He stayed in a small hotel near her apartment. They had dinner together and then breakfast the next morning, and these ordinary meals became, over time, the central ceremony of their rebuilt relationship. Walter showed Simone the shoebox of her notes on the 3rd visit. He had brought it with him in a canvas bag, unsure whether to show it or leave it in the car. He decided to show it. He took it out on the table between their dinner plates and opened it without saying anything, and Simone looked at the notes, organized by date, her own handwriting at 20 and 21, the person she had been before everything changed, and did not speak for a long moment. Then she said, "You kept all of them." "Of course," Walter said, as though the alternative had never existed. Simone went back to her apartment that evening and painted for 4 hours, a piece she later described as the first thing she had made in years that was entirely about joy rather than survival. It was a painting of a door with light coming through it. She sent a photograph of it to her father the next morning. He had it framed. It hangs in his classroom now above the board where his students see it every day. When they ask about it, he tells them the story. He tells them all of it. He has found, in the years since the taping, that the story has become the most useful piece of curriculum he has ever delivered, more useful than any lesson plan, more transferable than any historical case study. He tells 31 years of high school students about keeping the light on. He tells them about the slow, incremental work of maintaining faith in something you cannot verify. He tells them that history's most important lesson is that the distance between where things are and where they need to be is almost always crossable if someone is willing to hold the space while the crossing happens. His students, who are 17 and 18 years old and are navigating the particular turbulence of that age, listen to him with an attention he has not encountered in 3 decades of teaching. Because the story is true, and because they can tell it is true, and because true things land differently than constructed ones. Simone attended her first family Christmas in Louisville 16 months after the taping. She arrived on Christmas Eve and stayed through the 26th. The logistics of it, the spare room that had been her childhood bedroom, the family dynamics of a household she had been absent from for 17 years, the negotiation of how much passed to carry into a present that needed its own room to breathe, were navigated imperfectly and well. There were moments that were awkward. There were conversations that required more honesty than any of the participants had anticipated. There was one evening, after everyone else had gone to bed, when Walter and Simone sat in the kitchen and talked about the years in between with a directness that was difficult for both of them and necessary for both of them in equal measure. At the end of that conversation, near 2 in the morning, the house quiet around them, Simone told her father what she had told Steve Harvey on the stage, that she had needed to be whole before she could come back. She told him that wholeness had taken longer than she had expected and had required more work than she had anticipated, and had, on certain days in certain years, seemed entirely out of reach. And then she told him the part she had not said on the stage. She told him that on those days, the days when wholeness seemed out of reach, she had gone to his Facebook page and read his most recent post. And that reading it had been, consistently and without exception, the thing that restarted her. Not because it solved anything, not because it contained answers, but because it confirmed in plain and unperforming language that someone who knew her completely still believed she was worth finding. And that belief, applied to herself from the outside in, had kept her working. Walter listened to all of this without interrupting, the practice of 31 years in a classroom, the practice of a man who had learned that the most important thing he could do when someone was telling him something true was simply to receive it fully. When she finished, he said, "I knew you were reading them." Simone looked at him. "How?" "I didn't know, no," he said. "But I wrote them like you were. I figured if I wrote them like you were reading them, and you were, then I hadn't wasted a word. And if you weren't, I still hadn't wasted a word, because writing them was how I kept the story from ending." Simone was quiet for a long moment. "You should teach that," she said finally. "I do," he said. The follow-up segment aired 8 months after the original episode. Steve Harvey opened it by telling the audience that in 30-plus years of television, he had learned to distinguish between moments that were memorable and moments that were formative moments that actually changed the person who witnessed them. The Grimes reunion, he said, had been the second kind. He talked about the 5 seconds when Walter stood at the podium receiving the news. He talked about what he had seen in Walter's face during those seconds. Not joy, not relief, not disbelief, but something underneath all of those things. Something that had no ordinary name because it belonged to the category of experience that ordinary names are not built for. He said he had thought about those 5 seconds regularly since January at unexpected moments, and that each time he thought about them, they reminded him of something he considered essential. That the most important things a person does are often the things they do when they have no evidence that those things are being received. Walter's Facebook page, he noted, still existed. Walter still posted on it. He had updated it after the reunion with a single sentence: "She's home." Post had received over 2 million responses. The story of Walter and Simone Grimes is, in the final measure, a story about the particular form of courage that does not announce itself because it does not experience itself as courage. It experiences itself as the only available option. Walter Grimes did not believe he was doing something extraordinary by maintaining a public declaration of love for a missing daughter for 17 years. He believed he was doing the only thing a father could do. The extraordinary part, he would tell you, was not the keeping of the light on. The extraordinary part was that the light worked. Simone is still in Chattanooga. Her paintings have, since the episode aired, found a wider audience, something that happened without particular effort on her part, as a consequence of people who saw the clip seeking out her work online. She does not discuss the specifics of the years between publicly. Discusses, when asked, the process of return, what it requires, what it costs, and what it makes possible. She has become, without intending to and without particularly seeking it, a quiet resource for people in adjacent situations, people who left and are not yet ready to come back, people who are waiting for someone to come back. She does not give advice. She simply tells them what was true for her. She tells them the door that is being held open for you is not a trap. It is not a debt. It is exactly what it looks like, a door held open by someone who loves you more than they need you to explain yourself. Go through it when you are ready, but go through it.